Hey everyone, it's Y again, and for today's video, I want to talk about the visual issues that are currently present in Halo Reach on the Master Chief Collection. If you played Reach back on the Xbox 360 or through backwards compatibility, you may have noticed something seems a bit off regarding the visuals of the game on the Master Chief Collection. These visual issues can be attributed to a number of things that I want to talk about in today's video. But before I dive into those changes, I'd like to encourage everyone to submit any issues they have with the Master Chief Collection to the Halo support site. A lot of improvements have been made to the games in the collection over the years, and I'd like to continue seeing these improvements being made. Anyways, let's get back on track to the reason why you're probably here in the first place. You want to know how Reach differs visually from its legacy counterpart, and what's causing these visual changes. The first issue I want to bring up is one you may be familiar with if you've seen some of my previous videos. Just like how we saw in both Halo Combat Evolved and in Halo 2, the colors in Reach aren't matching their legacy appearance. Instead, they appear washed out in comparison. To show how the colors have changed, let's take a look at the opening cinematic for the game. During the segment, the screen dips to white to show the title of the game. The dissimilarity between the shades of white on the screen are quite apparent. The Master Chief Collection version is a considerably darker shade of white. This color discrepancy is going to change the overall visual presentation of the game and make it appear less vibrant, leaving the game with a washed out look to its colors, which was never the case in its original release. Restoring the colors to their proper appearance would not only be a huge visual improvement, but it would also be a big step forward in preserving Reach's legacy. The next topic I want to talk about is the lack of motion blur. Now I know motion blur isn't for everyone, but I'd like to see this restored as an optional setting that could be toggled on or off in the video settings for both Xbox and PC. The way motion blur was implemented in Reach made it so that objects would blur when they appeared to be in motion and were not near your reticle. See how objects in motion within a certain distance of your reticle position aren't being blurred? This made it easier to distinguish objects while still having the visual effects of motion blur. This particular effect is nowhere to be seen in the Master Chief Collection version of Halo Reach. Also, on a similar note, it's worth pointing out that the temporal anti-aliasing used by the original version of Reach caused a ghosting effect on moving objects. The Master Chief Collection uses a more modern version of anti-aliasing that doesn't have the ghosting as a side effect, meaning that bringing back motion blur as an optional setting shouldn't bring back the ghosting issues that the original game had. Up next, let's talk about light bloom. Light bloom is the visual effect of light emitting off an object. This effect is currently noticeably weaker than how it originally looked. Both objects that glow and reflective objects are going to appear flatter with this effect turned down. Oddly enough, the intensity of this effect appears to be tied to the resolution of the game. See how lowering the resolution helps bring the intensity of the effect back up? It doesn't quite reach the same level as its legacy counterpart, but it does make a noticeable difference. And while on the topic of lighting, there's a bug in the game that prevents certain objects, like foliage and garbage, from being illuminated from light sources such as lightning. These objects will also fail to become illuminated by night vision as well. One last note that I want to touch on regarding the game's lighting is that it's lacking both lighting and shadows that were present in the legacy version of the game. Sadly, this seems to be spread out across the game and not tied specifically to a specific cutscene or level. Ambient Occlusion, which is the effect that adds subtle shadows to objects, while it's present in the game, is bugged in a similar manner as light bloom, in the sense that the higher the resolution the game is in, the less prominent the effect becomes. In fact, it becomes nearly unidentifiable at higher resolutions. And when set to a lower resolution, it still doesn't quite match the legacy visuals. There's a focus effect used in certain cutscenes that shifts the camera's focus, making objects out of focus appear blurry. This, like some of the previously mentioned effects, is affected by the game's resolution. Higher resolutions seem to diminish the impact of this effect, while lower resolutions that are closer to that used by the legacy version have a more faithful appearance. If you have your crosshairs set to the lower position, it doesn't quite match up with the legacy positioning. It sits just a little higher up than it should be. This next effect may not be everyone's cup of tea, but again, I feel it's important to include it as a setting. It might be hard to see on YouTube, but the effect I'm referring to is the film grain. It appears to be less prominent, almost as if the grain itself is smaller at higher resolutions. Lowering the resolution helps bring the grain back up. Film grain is also present when using night vision as well. Again, we see resolution play a role in its appearance. As you'd expect, there's a lack of film grain when in a soft kill zone, and as a side note, the screen doesn't start turning red until slightly later than its legacy counterpart. I've noticed some instances where effects don't match legacy visuals, but do seem to be affected by the frame rate. Let's take a look at the rainfall. The individual raindrops appear to be more compressed than they should. On the left, we see the game running at 144 frames per second, and on the right, we see it running at 30 frames per second. See how the lower frame rate has longer streaks of rain? Now let's see how that compares to legacy. It's certainly a much closer match than the higher frame rate. Another example is how water reacts to movement. In the original, the water reacted in a realistic manner. On the Master Chief Collection, that's not the case, especially at higher frame rates. Lowering the frame rate to 30 certainly helps, but it's still not quite on par with legacy. It's not just the movement caused by walking through the water, but also driving through it as well. Even shooting the water has a slight bug where the impact effect is visible for just a bit too long. The last issue that I want to bring up is the discrepancy between the visuals of the shield doors seen on various levels and maps. As you can see from the gameplay here, the horizontal lines are missing their blue coloring. It's a good example how a seemingly small difference can make such a large visual impact. Reach is a great looking game that I feel isn't being properly represented in the Master Chief Collection. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great enhancements that have been made to Reach, but with these current issues that I've pointed out, there's still a lot more room for improvement. Hopefully, sometime in the not too distant future, we'll see these issues get resolved. Thanks for sticking around, and if you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like and subscribe to my channel for even more content. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.